Did the founders of the American Republic actually have a lower view of human nature than most of us do today? And would recovering that actually help improve the health of our democracy? Well, that's the interesting argument in Robert Tracy McKenzie's book, We the Fallen People. Let's take a look at it. Welcome to Books and Big Ideas, what I'm reading, what I'm thinking about, with Joel Wentz. All right, I have the pretty new book from IVP's academic line, We the Fallen People, by Robert Tracy McKenzie. And per my usual format, I'm going to talk about the main idea, the research behind the book, the readability of the style, and then some thoughts on my, takeaways, reasonableness of the argument. So the main idea, it's a fairly ambitious, it's not a very thick book, but it's a fairly ambitious book in its scope, so it's a little hard to synthesize down to a simple main idea. But I think it's something along these lines. Robert McKenzie is arguing that the founders, the so-called founders of the American Republic, the writers of the original kind of documents of our governance, actually had a pretty low to moderate view of the capacity for human virtue. And by virtue, they believed that virtue was to sacrifice for the common good. They actually believed that humans, kind of writ large, didn't tend towards that direction. And so that informed their ways they constructed the government, notably the Constitution. And so he is pushing back on a lot of the popular arguments that talk about the essential kind of goodness of America, and that America is good people. You know, that famous quote, America is great because she is good, which actually he argues is not attributed to Tocqueville. That kind of captures the ethos he's pushing really hard against, and he's actually trying to argue that the founders actually did not think that. And then a big part of his historical argument, which I'll comment on at the end, is he zooms in on the period of Andrew Jackson's ascent to the presidency and how a real decisive shift happened, so he argues, in the attitudes towards the American people around that populist movement, and that as it goes with populism, the idea is that the more people that have a stronger voice in the government, the better things will be. And so that leads to what Robert McKenzie calls a democratic faith, or just a faith in democracy as such, that there's nothing wrong with democracy that more democracy can't fix. Well, that really starts to get in question if you really start to zoom into the actual understanding of human nature and how that operates in a democracy. Because if a democracy is just giving unfettered access to pull the levers of government to more people, then what if your view of human nature is that human nature might not be that great? What does that mean, and what are the bearings of that on your ideas of governance and policy and all that? So yeah, like I said, really kind of hard to summarize in a sense, but basically he's arguing that the founders really had a much more kind of troubled view, at least looking back on it, that from what most people think today. They had a much more complicated view of the capacity for virtue in most people, and that informed their checks and balances in the government that they built. And finally, before I go to the next section, he's arguing that we would do well to recover that, kind of a modest sense of what Christians would call original sin. Though you don't need to use that language if that's uncomfortable. You could talk about just the kind of the tendency for humans to be greedy, for things to be broken, for us to not want the good of the other. We need to recover more of a modest sense of that in order for our democracy or for our government, for the health of our nation to really start to turn a corner. So that's what We the Fallen People is about. It's right there in the title, We the Fallen People. We need to recover a sense of our fallenness in order to get not only more in line with what the founders actually intended for the country, but just for us to have just a healthier kind of social fabric. So, wow, that's the main idea. I'll spend a lot more time on the main idea than I usually do. It's hard to summarize because there's a lot in this book, which is part of why I liked it. Okay, really quickly, the research. Robert McKenzie is an historian. The historical research is good, better than good actually. I was surprised. It's tilted at a more of a popular level of reading. So you could, sometimes I wonder at these attempts to kind of popularize historical arguments. I wonder how well researched they are. But this one really is full of a lot of primary citations from things like the Federalist Papers or journals and letters that have been published from people like Madison and Hamilton and, a lot of the people that were writing in that kind of era of the early Republic. It's a lot of primary quotes, especially as he's building out his argument about what their view of human nature was. So it's very, very well researched, very trustworthy, I think, representation of the research. He also does very thoughtful engagement with Tocqueville's work in one great section of the book, and then he also has a very well researched and reasoned argument about some of Jacksonian era policies, notably what led to the Trail of Tears. And also the war with the banks. So it's just all really, really rigorously researched historical content, and I found it, I found him to be a trustworthy historical kind of voice. So strong research. And then the readability, which is the next thing I like to comment on. I already kind of hinted at this, but it's written in a surprisingly approachable, not conversational, but just a surprisingly flowing, easy to read style. It's actually a very enjoyable book to read purely stylistically. Whether or not you agree with the argument is another thing in terms of its enjoyment, but just stylistically it flows really well. Very easy to get immersed into the writing and the argument that he's making and the portrayal of the people that he's putting forward. And in particular, in terms of style and thoughtfulness and nuance, the chapter specifically on Jackson's policies that led to what we know as the Trail of Tears, what was called the Indian removal kind of policy mix of things. That chapter on that era of history is one of the best single kind of pieces I've read on that subject ever. I just thought it was an astounding chapter, so good, so well researched and presented and coherently argued, but also nuanced and avoiding simplistic kind of judgments. Really, really good, and it's highly readable the whole way through. So I have very positive things to say about this book, as you can probably tell, but the readability is also very high. And then finally, the reasonableness. I can't go into all, and I can't do it and keep this video short at least, but I can't go into all the contours of the argument because it's kind of a lot in one book. And almost my only ding against it is that I almost wish this had been busted out into a couple books, because he takes on a lot. He takes on presenting a case about the founders' views of humanity and human capacity for virtue. That's one whole section. There's a whole section zooming in on Jackson-era policies and Andrew Jackson's life and ascent to the presidency and what that means for populism and what that means about kind of shifting understandings of democracy itself. Then there's a whole section on Tocqueville and Tocqueville's views of democracy and really engaging with Tocqueville's works in the primary sense. And then there's a whole section on kind of what does this mean for us today. It's a lot presented in a small package, and I almost wish it had been busted out so you could go in more depth. I'd like to read a lot more about Tocqueville, for example, than what's even included here, because this is super fascinating to me. So that's my only ding against it. It just goes through a lot of material, but on the positive side, it's a lot combined into one volume in an approachable way. So that might be actually a plus for most people. Not everyone would like to read multiple books like I would, I guess, on the subject. But just take that for what it's worth and where you're coming at it. Reasonably, just the reasonableness overall, I'm basically convinced. He actually shifted my own paradigm over the course of reading this. I already had a somewhat critical eye of Jackson's populism, but he really pushed that another degree for me reading that section. He also added a nuance and a wrinkle into my own understanding of what the founders were trying to do and kind of how they had been influenced by certain philosophies, namely about human virtue at the time. And he also does a great job not sliding into simplistic arguments about the founders, particularly when it comes to their faith and their religious commitments. He doesn't fall into any traps that a lot of writers tend to fall into. He does get into some polemics against some other writers that are making simplistic historical arguments about America today, namely people like Eric Metaxas. He calls them out pretty strongly, but I think confidently and appropriately when they need to be corrected. So there's also kind of current cultural criticism going on there. But at the end of the day, I found the historical argument very convincing. That, simply put, the founders of the American project believed that humans were not naturally very virtuous, and we needed to build into some sort of republic. We needed to build in that own understanding into the structures of government. Because if humans are not naturally virtuous, then just giving unfettered democratic kind of voice to the people is going to mean you're going to have not virtuous things happen. And he argues that's precisely what happened in Jackson's presidency. Jackson being the first president who was actually basically disconnected from the founding generation, and this whole wave of populism that entered that produces things like the Trail of Tears, which is not good, not virtuous, but McKenzie would argue it was literally democratic. It was the will of the people. So this is a really, really important argument for us to wrestle with today, especially as we're thinking about things like populism and democracy, all the conversations on voting rights that are happening in America, at least as I record this in early 2022. What does it mean for human virtue and the capacity for human virtue, and also the capacity for non-virtue, things like greed, things like hatred of the other, enemy making? Like, what does that mean as we think more thoughtfully about how do we build a healthy democracy, and how do we not, particularly he's writing from a Christian viewpoint, but I would argue that this is not really a book that's only for Christians. I would really like to think that non-Christians would have a lot to chew on here, especially if you're interested in civics and politics. But what does it mean that as we move forward, try to build a healthier democratic society? What does it mean to reclaim a sense of our kind of lack of virtue, and not just simplistically assume that more democracy will fix anything that's wrong with our current setup? Maybe there are other things we need to look to. So that's We the Fallen People. I really appreciated this book a lot for all the reasons I just mentioned. There's a lot here to unpack, and it also points towards deeper resources. I, for example, would really like to learn more about Tocqueville and actually possibly read some Tocqueville after reading this. So that's a huge takeaway for me. But a fantastic new book. I would highly recommend it if you're interested in anything I just talked about. I think it might go a little bit under the radar. And so that's part of the reason I'm featuring it here on my channel, because I'd really like to get it in the hands of more people, because I think it deserves a little bit more of a hearing. So that's We the Fallen People by Robert Tracy McKenzie. Great new book. Highly recommended. As always, hope you found something here that was at least thought-provoking, provocative, interesting, intriguing to you. And as always, thank you for taking some time to watch.